afternoon. I'm Allyson Delnore. I'm the Interim Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Today, I'm excited to welcome you all to the first in our the semester in our series of Conversations on Europe, which is a monthly series funded in part by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission and through a National Resource Centers grant from the US Department of Education. This semester, as part of our Year of Recovering Europe, we're exploring the idea of reckoning with the past. And today's session is the first to engage this broader topic. Thanks to support from our partners at universities throughout the US through our Jean Monnet in the US network, and with special thanks to our co-sponsoring partners, Miami, Florida Jean Monnet European Center of Excellence, the Florida International University, the EU Center at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Thanks in particular to my colleagues on the back end, Iris Matijevich and Kenny Riley, for their help coordinating today's session. Today, for Reckoning with the Past, we will be talking about decolonizing the curriculum in Europe. A lot of this stems from recent conversations that have been happening both in the US and abroad. In 2018, the Royal Historical Society in Britain published a report documenting, quote, significant and disproportionate levels of discrimination, bias, and harassment towards Black and minority ethnic history students and researchers. When surveyed in 2020, 84 British universities declared a general commitment to, quote, making their curricula more diverse, international, or inclusive, end quote. 24 universities in Britain went even further and declared a commitment to decolonizing their curricula more generally. But they're not alone. Many educators, though by no means all, throughout Europe, from primary and secondary schools to colleges and universities, have expressed a desire to decolonize the curriculum. But what does that mean? And what kind of opposition has there been? Today, I'm pleased to welcome our panel of distinguished scholars to discuss these questions and many more. I'll introduce each of them in turn briefly to allow more time for conversation. The length of my introduction is by no means an indication of the esteem with which I hold them in, but we will have longer bios available on our website and when the video is posted as well. So let me introduce them. First, Dr. Rowena Arshad is Professor Emerita at the University of Edinburgh. She has published extensively on education and social justice and served on a number of boards to advance this work. In 2019, she was awarded a CBE for services to equality in education. Also joining us today, Dr. Paweł Lewicki, who I may have just ruined the name, but I will rectify it, from the Europa-Universität Viadrina. Dr. Lewicki is an anthropologist who works on borders, medical anthropology, Europeanization, and EU citizenship. He's explored East-West relations in Europe through a post-colonial lens, engaging dynamics of race, gender, and sexuality in his analyses. I'm also pleased to welcome Louie Dean Valencia joining us from Texas. Dr. Valencia is an assistant professor of digital history and is coordinator of the Center for Public History at Texas State University. His work focuses on contemporary Europe, the history of fascism, anti-fascism, youth and queer studies, collective memory, and digital culture and methods. And finally, rounding out the panel from here at Pitt, my colleague, Dr. Mohammed Bamyeh. Dr. Bamyeh is a professor of sociology, interested in social movements and revolutions, the nature of conservatism, and the sociology of religion. He most recently served as president of the Arab Council for Social Sciences. So we have a nice multidisciplinary group, and I have a few questions that I'm just going to start the conversation with, and I'm going to throw them out to the group. Meanwhile, for those of you joining us, please feel free to put your own questions in the Q&A using the Zoom feature, and we will get to them throughout, interspersing them throughout the conversation, but please do feel free to engage. So my first question goes to the whole group, but I'm going to start with Dr. Arshad. So let's start with a big broad one. What does it mean to decolonize the curriculum, and why is it important as an intellectual exercise? Dr. Arshad?
Thanks, Allyson, and hoping you can all hear me. I think for me, it's decolonizing the curriculum is a critical analysis of how colonialism and imperialism has shaped forms of knowledge, but also creation of intellectual hierarchies as a result of that. And then the rewarding of such knowledge, where some sources of knowledge, particularly the global South, indigenous knowledge, and so forth, have been marginalized and dismissed. It's 500 years in the making, so it's going to be a big job to try and do this. And I think it's also something to do with about the West stopping to see itself as a giver and and a teacher, whereas those of us who are not from the West, particularly the South, etc., as takers and needing to be taught. Why is it important as an intellectual exercise? Well, we're academics. We value intellectual robustness. And Edward Said said, this process of decolonizing is to understand what exactly happened, why it happened, and who we are. So it shouldn't be difficult for us as academics to be contesting knowledges and to start viewing these knowledges as horizontal instead of hierarchical. Not least also, I think our world is getting more complex. And so we need diverse perspectives in order to actually get solutions to address global issues. So I think that's where I start off, and lovely to hear other people's views too.
It's a fantastic summary. Does anybody want to add on?
I'll go ahead and jump in. Yeah, I think everything that Dr. Arshad said is spot on. And I really appreciated when she was talking about this idea of thinking horizontally. And that's sort of one of the things that I've been trying to grapple with myself in sort of any of the European history classes is how do you sort of restructure those kind of hierarchies even within the classroom. And I think one of the things is oftentimes because we're trained in a particular way, particularly in my field in history, the types of sources that you start off with, the types of things you read as a graduate student, all those things influence your starting point. And it's sometimes nice to be able to work with students who have maybe not the same basis as I do, or as most of us academics, to sort of just give them a little bit of liberty to go find sources themselves. And it's another way of trying to challenge that hierarchical structure. In one of my classes right now, the assignment is go find primary sources that you don't think that I would have encountered. And it's something very specific like that. And I think kind of going toward Dr. Arshad's point of how do you challenge those hierarchies, I think it starts with that sort of movement for me, at least.
That's really interesting.
May I add something as well, or is it?
Go ahead, Mohammed, and then we'll go to Paweł.
Okay, I actually agree with everything that has been said. This is a crucial project, and of course will take many years for us to get there if we actually eventually get there. But the thing to do, I think, or the way to think about it is to kind of divide up the decolonization process into several components, I think. There are things we can do in the classroom, for example, like the pedagogical kind of aspect. And I think we can talk a little bit about examples of things that have been in the classroom. I think this is very important. I try to do what I regard to be decolonial practices in my own classroom. I can maybe discuss that a little bit if there's time. Also, there is our institutional level, namely how does the institution itself help or not help us actually in this process in terms of its policies, in terms of how it defines knowledge, in terms of how it defines what kind of institutions or directions of research and teaching are worthy of being invested in. And also there's a question of the content of kind of this kind of funding or this kind of investment in decolonization. Namely, are we just bringing in, say, more Black and brown faces into campus, or are we actually changing the structure of thinking that predominates in the disciplines, basically. And so those are three levels, I think, where we can actually think about different ways kind of thinking about decolonization kind of inputs.
That's great. And I actually hope to get to those throughout. So that's a great way of setting up the conversation. Paweł, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, you know, I'm interested in Europe and European studies and how Europe is conceived. And, you know, if you think about decolonization, Europe seems to be still like a very important part of that. And for me, it's also, you know, grappling with this race, what everyone said already, you know, racist knowledge production, but also, you know, European modernity and European epistemology, and, you know, how we can make it visible in the changes of this racist and, you know, hierarchical thinking, how we can make it visible in many different areas of our society.
Yeah, this is great. And it's a fantastic blueprint for the conversation, and also speaks to a lot of the projects that our center at Pitt has been engaged in, especially this idea of decolonizing European studies, which I think has a specific set of challenges that I hope we can talk about today. I want to go back a little bit to something that Mohammed mentioned in his opening comments, and that is about the sort of institutional level. And so to what extent, you know, what are we talking about really? To what extent have universities reproduced the kinds of colonial hierarchies that we're talking about? And how much of this is structural and systemic? You want to start, Mohammed?
Sure.
You brought it up.
Okay, maybe I should not have. All right. The universities are generally conservative institutions, and they don't like to change. Especially universities that are structured like around departments, like Pitt. These tend to kind of become established units that get the kind of support on the basis of doing what they already do. Right? So there is kind of, in a way, even though everyone I talk to seem to be committed to decolonizing knowledge, and in theory they are for it. Once you begin to talk about practical things to do, then you begin to see how difficult this is going to be. Now, I can give you some examples about things that can be changed, right, in terms of the how the university does its business. In terms of how to think. Let me just say one thing about a concrete example to talk about, say, Islam in Germany and how it is taught at German universities, so that we are actually on the ground. There are basically two models for teaching, for actually approaching Islam in German university in particular. That may be true in other European countries as well, but this is the example I know best. There is the old-fashioned Orientalist philological kind of text-based kind of tradition, which is very old and very strong still, and that is very historical, kind of connects to antiquity, to the classics, and so on. And that is part of what Edward Said was criticizing, for, of course, different reasons that then fit into Germany. German Orientalism is maybe a little bit different. The other kind of approach is modern, and that deals with modern Islam. And this is a new direction in European universities. Now, the questions here that dominate kind of this approach is, how do we make Islam compatible with, say, liberal values? How do we produce an interpretation of Islam that convinces Muslims that Islam is compatible with the human rights, gender equality, homosexuality, democracy, all that stuff? The problem, of course, with that approach, even though it seems to be officially about diversity, the religious people themselves are never asked about the Fragestellung. They are not asked about how they actually would like, right, kind of their religion to be taught and approached, or what kind of values kind of they kind of church. So in a way, one problem with this kind of approach to diversity, it is while it is well-meaning, I don't disagree with it actually, and I don't disagree with the intentions necessarily, but it is not based on communication with the people who are diverse themselves. They are never asked, in fact, we would like to integrate you into our curriculum. What do you think? What is actually important for you? And I think actually that applies to the US as well. If you want to do kind of more kind of Black, Latino, etc. studies into the curriculum, it would make sense to actually go to those communities and ask them, what is it actually that you would like us to teach about you or for you or through you, so to speak, as opposed to say, let's just hire more Black or brown people and just put them there and say, we have accomplished diversity and decolonize the curriculum. It doesn't really work. Actually, this project with Decolonizing does not really work without lots of communication with people who are affected by this kind of knowledge, and be prepared to surprising outcomes. So not, if you do that kind of communication, you are going, including with non-academics, right? You would end up with something that we might call decolonial, but it may not, in fact, kind of be satisfactory to the people who want to defend the way disciplines as are practiced, the way they are practiced right now.
Paweł, please.
Can I add just something to that? Because I totally agree with what Mohammed said, and I can see that also in academia, also at my university. But what I really miss also, apart from what he said, is the racism and the race critical perspective, also in migration studies or in this frame of study on Islam. It's not migrants are constantly seen as those, in economical terms, which is in a way, it's not in a way, it's a colonial kind of thinking. And it's not, and they're perceived as those who have to, integrate, and not the, and the spotlight is not, put back on us, what are we doing and how are we allowing their stories to be heard.
Rowena, you have your hand.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, totally agree with both Mohammed and Paweł, but the question that you also asked was, is it structural and systemic? And it's obviously structural as well, because, and I want to give another example, because Mohammed said it's not just in what we teach, is the whole aspect of the institutions, and that's absolutely right. It's also how we teach and what happens in the classroom. So I just want to give an example. I have a colleague called Lauren Hall-Lou, who's a sociolinguist, and she talks about how colonial frameworks impact on the area of assessment and how we mark. So I'm situated in the global north. I'm in the UK in an elite university, but many of our students are international and come from different education systems. There is an expectation that they will all aspire and speak to and be able to write in Queen's English and write to particular structures and practices. And in our common marking framework, to get an A, you have to show flawlessness in your grammar and spelling, good standard of academic writing, and for fail, awkward writing style, lack of attention to spelling, grammar, and so forth. So linguistic remediation seems to be required for all of us who cannot write in Queen's English or do not have that. So what Lauren says is that she will not use ideological terms like flawless or good standard in her marking. She will explain the style of writing or usage that the student has does differ from the current norms of British academic English, and she does alert them to importance of linguistic code switching. But what she's trying to work towards is a decolonial approach to marking, and she will not penalize her students as a result of the colonial framework. Now, I think that this is another example of how the structures do need to be really deconstructed. Not popular. I think she's trying to get that pushed through. I can just imagine a lot of quality assurance comments being made on this one back to her, but I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, interesting. Louie Dean.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I'm thinking about through just in structurally and systematically is sort of even the programs that we offer, right? The degrees. For example, even in my own institution, European Studies major has been existent for 20, 25 years, something like that. Whereas we only have barely gotten an African Studies minor, I think within the last 2 years. So it's one of those things where even the motivation to get these types of programs takes a lot of resources to be able to create a curriculum, to be able to put that sort of effort into proposing a new major, minor, what have you. And I think that even just thinking about sort of the bureaucratic hurdles to create new programming and all of those sort of things have to be sort of considered at the heart of some of these things. And so also trying to think about, well, how is it that we existing programs, and I know this is probably controversial, is how do existing programs or disciplines work together? I think might be something also to kind of think through, because oftentimes one program or one department might be better situated than another to sort of take a lead in certain types of things. And oftentimes we're very territorial. And I sort of think of this in colonialist terms in some senses, that in being territorial about our programming, about what we're doing, there can be sort of a lack of opportunity for these collaborations across departments. And I think that's another way to sort of maybe even think about our own institutions is, how is it that we're not being interdisciplinary? How are we not trying to support each other across disciplines or across departments?
All of these are excellent points, but it just highlights exactly how big of a task we have in front of us. And I think that, you know, you've highlighted some really some surprising ways, or ways that people might not have thought of, in which these kind of colonial power relations can be reproduced. But how do we break that down? And you've suggested some of these things, I think, in our conversation, but, you know, from a more positive angle, what are some additional ways that we can work to build more inclusive curricula? And I'll start with Louie Dean, because I haven't started with you yet.
Great. Well, I think that part of it is making resources more available. That's one thing that I'm trying to work with in sort of my own class. This semester, I have a class that's called The Myths of Western Civilization, Decolonizing Querying European History. And in the class, part of the idea is that the students' final project is to create a website with resources that are available for middle school and high school teachers, not necessarily targeting solely for university sort of audiences. And I think that one way I'm trying to reimagine sort of my role is less as the professor who professes and more of a facilitator of some of those conversations and of project ideas. And I think that very concretely, having primary sources that are translated into different languages is helpful. That's one challenge I've always had in some of my classes, particularly history classes, is if we're looking at texts that are sort of those, you know, source books, like this is a source book of different primary sources. It's usually something that was edited maybe 15, 20 years ago, which generally has some good stuff, but it's not thinking in terms of how to diversify even sort of the starting point. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to very actively work on is some of my favorite texts are not even available in English, and trying to find sort of those types of things for students. And maybe if they read it and they're like, oh, well, this is interesting. And it can spur sort of this dynamic where people start to look into, well, what are atypical sources, in quote, atypical sources, right? And I think that that's one way that these sort of starting points need to change, is sort of instead of looking for the textbook, trying to think, and it's a lot more work, right, to find these other types of sources that might not be listed in all of our academic journals, and they might not be the ones that everybody knows about, and people might even think that they're not even worthy of teaching, right? And so there's those sort of arguments that you have to even make. But I think like those are sort of the places where I like to start.
If I can add something to that, actually, this is actually excellent. Yeah, excellent suggestions. I'd like to toss in a couple things, actually, in addition. One of them is foreign languages, actually, which in the US in particular are or seem to be disappearing as a requirement. In fact, which is actually the opposite direction from decolonial knowledge. Right? If you want to do anything decolonial, right, you need to know some foreign language. At least you should be interested in it, right? And those actually should be required, kind of, as opposed to devalued. I expect everyone in the world to speak English. So that is one thing that I think the languages should really come back to be the core of university education. That's absolutely essential. And basically just relying on English is a form of colonialism. That itself is a colonial knowledge that everyone is expected to speak English everywhere in the world. The other thing that I learned about the value of interdisciplinarity, right, which I think also is decolonial practice if it is done right. And that is something I learned from my work with the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, namely how in other parts of the world, right, social sciences mean something very different than they mean in the US, for example. Right? Also, the way they mix with other cultures of knowledge is much more explicit than it is in the US. For example, the relationship between sociology and literature, or sociology and cinema, for example, is much obvious actually in the global South. And that I know not just from my work with the Arab Council, but also as an editor of an international journal with the International Social Association. Kind of, if you look around the world, people do their science differently than the way we do it. Right? So that exploring that kind of relationship between cultures of knowledge, how we might try to practice some of that in our universities, right? To the extent that makes sense, or at least in an experimental way, is, I think, one way to pay respect to decolonial knowledge. Decolonial knowledge, not just the knowledge of oppressed people, so to speak, but how kind of elsewhere in the world, in response to kind of the vast array of social and political problem brought about by the colonial experience, the kind of knowledge that responds to that is itself a complex knowledge. Right? And it is not just sociology or anthropology or political science as taught in the American sense. It's not that way in the rest of the world. Right? So basically, how to link interdisciplinary kind of interests that is actually in much of the global South is done much more organically and with much more kind of joy, so to speak, right? Kind of one can learn from in our otherwise kind of really frozen institutional kind of boxes that we have in US as well as in European universities.
Unmute yourself.
That's fantastic. You'd think I'd have learned after this long. But I was so excited because that exactly speaks to one of the projects that we are so invested in right now, which is, you can say what you will, and there's much to say about the colonial and Cold War roots of area studies, right? That I'm engaged in a European Studies Center. But also the possibility for those to flip, right? They don't have to be vested in these, reproducing these colonial things. They don't have to be speaking to these Cold War, understandings of how the world is design, but what we can do is we can take advantage of the fact that they are interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary spaces within college campuses that encourage language learning, and particularly given the funding out there that encourage the learning of indigenous, less commonly taught minority languages. So these can be spaces where maybe this is where a fruitful conversation can be had, which is what we're hoping here at Pitt. But I'm stepping on someone's toes. Someone else had their hands up. Was it Paweł? Yeah, Paweł, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because, you know, a lot of has been already said about this. And I think, and also refer to Louise, that, you know, the decolonization can happen if it's a decolonization of epistemology, then it has to be also decolonization of methodology. And for me as an anthropologist, it's, you know, it's the you know, more explorative methodologies and collaborative methodologies, you know, with activists, and in order, you know, to include these other voices, and then on the more conceptual level also, like, you know, race critical perspectives, and most of all, you know, intersectional perspective that as I said already, like, to trace back all these developments of racist thinking.
Well, unlike in other sessions we have of conversations on Europe, where often audience questions come in a little bit later, and we're already starting to get some. So I'm actually going to turn to a couple. They weren't on, you know, in things that we talked about, we might talk about, but I think that we've got some great questions being asked by the audience. So my colleague here at Pitt, Dr. Maureen Porter in the School of Education, has asked, what have you seen as actual authentic best practices for systemic change in how scholars are funded, acknowledged, accessed in teaching, and rewarded tenure for decolonial work? So it relates to a conversation we've had, right? But it's getting into some of the nuts and bolts of how universities actually work and reward work. So she asked, she mentioned some decolonial principles and timelines are directly counter to what is valued. Does anybody want to speak to that? Someone with tenure, please.
I don't have tenure, but
well, you're braver than I.
there we go. I'm going up for tenure this year, so it is a thing that's very real, I think, in my mind. And sort of, I think one way I like to think about it is, I've worked with a lot of great colleagues within my university across departments who've really been able to guide me in a lot of ways of, like, maybe step back a little bit from this part, maybe be sort of aware of, like, who your allies are. And I think, like, most of the time, most people will be very supportive if you're upfront with what you're doing. I think that's one thing that I've found, at least in my institution, which is a university of 40,000 students, huge departments, and there's enough people there who are willing to give support and help. On my own research, on my when I just talk through, like, what it is that I want to do and sort of goals. And I think, like, to some degree, it's best case scenario for me, I guess. But I do think that it's a lot of trying to communicate with other people, even if they're not maybe in your own department, people across other departments who have similar interests. And it's in those ways that you can start to maybe build, I don't even think of it as allyship per se, but at least build a network of people who are willing to support each other.
Mohammed.
Yeah, I think I have tenure, so I can, and I sit on tenure committees a lot, actually. And one thing that I keep on fighting against is a general tendency to say that excellence at means that you publish in some prominent established journals. Now, the problem, of course, with that way of thinking is that typically all those journals are US-based journals, for the most part. And they have a very specific kind of way of thinking about what excellence means in a discipline, so to speak. And often their viewpoint, from my point of view, is narrow. That is, the top journals in sociology are not interested in decolonial knowledge. They are interested in maybe sociologists from colonial background, write like white people and publish the same thing, and then they get tenure, to speak, right? But not to change the way we think about the discipline. So decolonial background should have no impact on knowledge, according to this way of thinking. The same thing when we talk about publishing in the prominent journals in philosophy or prominent journals, political science, that questions come up and again. So we have a ranking system, basically, in terms of tenure criteria, that namely, if you publish here, that is good because that is where our best scholars, who are all white, have published, and according to, and this is the style that they use and do like them, to speak. So I don't think actually we do talk about I mean, you can write a book, for example, criticizing colonialism, and you can get tenure for it. That's not what I'm actually. So that happens. It's not as though you are not allowed to criticize the colonial heritage, but kind of what is getting reward is being acknowledged kind of in the prominent venues of the discipline as actually, as work actually counting as belonging there. And so one way to go about that is to say we should just stop paying attention to what we call prominent journals. We should not actually necessarily respect those hierarchies. We can say, well, any publication venue that you choose, for your work is fine, and we can, as your colleagues, we can evaluate the content of your work, but not just look at the fact that it was published in some prominent journal, and on the basis of that, we'll give you tenure, which continues to be often kind of the more common practice to do. So kind of the question of hierarchies kind of in the academic world in terms of what journals count, which does not count, does affect how people think and how they write and what kind of knowledge they produce. It does have impact, and it does discourage what we the decolonial knowledge that we kind of understand as we happen to be discussing now. Other form of hierarchy that does not help is the ranking system of the universities. The worst thing that has happened in higher education is the ranking system. And that is because it ranks institutions that are very different from each other. If you are sitting in Cairo, for example, Cairo University, and it is a great university at the local level, but the global ranking system does not tell you what it is doing in its own environment. It tells you how it does compare to Harvard. And it does not show up very well if you do that way. But if you do the kind of ranking that is more ecologically kind of based, namely, how does an institution live in its own environment, then that would be a kind of ranking, so to speak, that actually makes sense. But comparing all universities in an entire country or an entire world, as people do now, make administrators just lose sight of the kinds of things that are actually working inside their institution. And they stop paying attention only to what they have to do to move up in the ranking. They stop looking at the local reality and look elsewhere. And their tendency to become similar to others, so to speak, which is another way to reproducing the colonial heritage, which was about reproducing global similarities, which is what we are trying to get away from.
Very interesting points, yes. Rowena.
Thanks, Allyson. I think that in a way this goes wider, doesn't it? It's actually about what institutions are prepared to do to diversify its workforce at every level and to ensure representation. And in certainly in my university, what they've tried to do as a baseline is to get data. Who do we employ? Who's on short-term contracts? Who, in fact, doesn't get promoted? And you're cutting across all characteristics here, and things are showing up. We know that there is a ethnic pay gap. We know that there is a gender pay gap, and so on and so forth. And hard questions have to be asked, and then things have to be put in place. And I think alongside that are the ranking issues, but also it's about selection panels. I have seen where selection panels have been filled with people who actually understand the issues and who are not just going to conform and engage in conformity bias, then changes will happen. So that's one way that we can actually be doing it. It's pretty hard though, because challenging established and status quo practices brings you enemies from every quarter. So the networks that Louie Dean talked about, the support structures are absolutely important here.
Yeah, and we can think not only about, tenure and further on and once you are employed, but just the graduate education, right? How we're even training people who are going to become the next generation. The standards by which they're measured are all sort of some of these same problems. We had another question from the audience that speaks a little bit to this and asks, what impact can open source academic materials have on decolonizing the curriculum? Is that a potential avenue? Louie Dean.
Yeah, I think that textbooks is sort of my favorite conversation of the moment. So in my class, one thing that I have students do, and this is a class that's on basically trying to look at the broad scope of quote unquote European history. I assign to the students the task of finding the cheapest, oldest textbook that possibly can. And everybody comes in with a different textbook. And the idea of it is for us, whenever we come to the class, to compare what is included, what is not included. And I think that's one way of sort of having students question the authority of the textbook, which I think is always very helpful. And their sort of assignments are built out of trying to fill in what is missing from those textbooks. And ideally, what I want students to be able to do is, and this is, I think, sort of the challenge of knowledge production, is copyright. How do you put things out in the world that are helpful for this sort of open source question for instruction whenever a lot of our things are copyrighted? And I think that that's one of the things that maybe working with academics individually are going to have to start to try to figure out is how do we make some of that knowledge more available and for free, or trying to find ways of, I think more ideally, recompensing some sort of structure that makes that knowledge valued, right? And so I think like those are the sort of challenges that we have right now, is trying to figure out how to negotiate those types of things. As it stands, most academic journals you don't get paid for, right? So what is it that we're going to do to try to alleviate some of those sort of places? I know that there are some online textbooks that are now becoming available for free, but they're not necessarily open source usually, right? They're kind of piecemeal. I know in American studies, they're trying to do that a little bit more. I haven't really seen a lot of that in European studies, but there's sort of efforts to put some teaching materials out, at least, which I think is one thing, but trying to really think through of how are we going to make these resources available, but also not static. And I know, for example, my graduate school, Fordham University, has a primary source database that they've had up for 20 some odd years. The links don't always work, but it's something that I think is really sort of core to trying to make these things available.
Yeah, you know, in sort of, I've used that very, you know, database before in teaching, and super helpful. And it goes to another point I should make, is that one of the things we always do with these conversations is we collect, you know, ideas about books and further readings and materials and places where you can look. So if anybody has any of those, feel free to send them to us through email or through the chat, and we're going to collect them and put them up with the video as resources to others, because trying to make information more available, I think, is one of the keys for lots of things. Let me shift a little bit to think about this issue of the movement to decolonize the curriculum, which is really ramped up, I think, in the last couple of years. But, you know, I think back to, say, like 2016 with the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa and in Europe. And I'm thinking of a lot of the student protests and calls to action that we're seeing here in the United States, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter. And I'm wondering how much of what we've been talking about, especially at the university level, has been driven by student protests. I mean, we've talked a lot about faculty responses and what faculty can do, but how much are the students kind of driving this, or at least motivating this? Rowena?
Yeah, okay, so I'll start. So in Scotland, I think student action, particularly in the ancient universities, have made an impact. So in Edinburgh, for example, a group of students organised themselves, and they called themselves Black Ed. And they launched a petition via change.org, making 4 demands of the university: that we make a clear statement about issues of detriment to the BME community, Black minority ethnic communities, but also the impact of COVID-19. So this is all occurring at that point. So that was the first demand. The second was to ask the university to start promoting an anti-racist culture. The third demand was to actually have a comprehensive zero tolerance policy on racism, racial microaggressions, and to provide an effective report and support platform for Black students and students of colour. And the fourth was to actually create better representation across at every level. Now, this petition gained over 8,000 signatures within a couple of days. University comms team surely responded proactively and positively then, because if nothing else, I've learned over the years, university comms teams are there to protect the reputation of the university. So when it's so public, we have to be seen to respond. So I don't know why I'm using the collective we, because I'm not representing the university. But yes, the answer is yes, the student protest has made a difference.
Do you see that in Germany as well, Paweł?
Yeah, I'm teaching now a class on racism in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's a postgraduate course. And I'm really surprised by how they are aware of the issues that, of racism, and they are also keen on dismantling the structures of producing hierarchies, and giving them the tools to dismantle them, or not to reproduce them. So it's very much there. I'm not sure about all these. Well, I think it's less maybe racism, or at least from what I see, it's less racism, but more gender diversity and sexuality that is maybe more present. And there are a lot of activities on that, at least at my university, and pushing for more progressive and less hierarchized curricula.
Louie Dean, please.
Yeah, I think sort of the question of what students are doing is really sort of at the forefront of how to make a really good argument as for the need of this sort of diversity in our programming and the curricula generally, especially if you're dealing with a neoliberal sort of institution, right? What is it that the students are wanting? And I think that that's one really fundamentally necessary argument that we have in our favor here, is that students are much more aware of issues around race, gender, sexuality than they were 15 years ago, for example. When I think about sort of the student I was teaching a decade ago even, a lot of these types of discussions were very difficult to have. You were starting at the beginning. Now, oftentimes students come in with these sort of basic ideas, and it's really, the learning curve is much quicker to talk about, well, where do these types of things come from? And so I think that we're in this moment that we actually have a real advantage in how to discuss these issues, not just amongst ourselves as academics, but also thinking about, well, if students are coming in with these types of ideas, that means that these questions are happening in broader society. And that also means that there is this sort of backlash that's happening. So I think that really it's one of those moments where we don't need to be shying away from the question, but really creating a forum where these things can be discussed. And I think that's the best sort of argument for why we need to have a decolonized curriculum, is for these types of discussions to really take place. I know I've done a lot of work with the Council for European Studies at Columbia, for example. And these are discussions that are happening at higher levels there. It's discussions that are happening amongst the junior scholars. It's happening amongst the graduate students who I talk to in sort of these seminar type of things. And I think that a lot of people in particular who are going into European studies right now are very invested in these issues. So I think to some degree, it's a question not just of supporting students who are protesting on campus, but also trying to think about what are those students' goals, what are their paths, how do we integrate those types of really activist voices into not just our classroom, but into scholarship, and to giving them the types of resources to do the work that they want to do. And I think that's a real question of not just like saying, okay, they're protesting, but how do you empower them to make change?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, and I like how you linked it to European studies. Let me first say that, for those of you in the audience, please submit your questions. We want to know what you want to know about, and I'm happy to ask those. But I also, coming at it for myself, I teach this course that's very introductory course called What is Europe? And, it's supposed to be an introduction to European studies, but it's also supposed to challenge somebody's preconceptions about Europe as they come into the class and before they begin a broader study of Europe. And it's interesting to me that at that level, in the sort of, first and second year students, what I'm finding myself is that students aren't entering European studies in order to challenge or to explore diversity in the curriculum, right? They're abandoning European studies for those reasons. They're going elsewhere. And so I think an interesting challenge for European studies is, how do you decolonize the curriculum? How do you decolonize European studies, remain relevant, and then also speak with and to other disciplines, areas, fields, world regions, and really bring those conversations together. Yeah, so that was just an aside. I also wanted to ask, as we sort of, as we see what other questions people might have, we've talked a lot about the post-secondary level, but I think there's interesting stuff to talk about at the primary and secondary education, especially when you think about primary education, right? It becomes this kind of universal primary education in a way to create citizens of nations, right? I mean, going back to sort of the origins of universal education. So at the core of the project is instilling common values. So I'm curious about, would a radical decolonization of a K through 12 curriculum mean calling those common values into question? And is that where we're seeing some pushback? Does anybody have any thoughts on what this means for non-universities, for earlier in the curriculum. Paweł.
Oh, for non-universities, I'm not sure. But if you think about this political project of European identity, it's a very colonial project of producing this white Christian, Judeo-Christian, tolerant and rational subject, and the outcomes are already seen at the borders of Europe, where all the allegedly others are not let in, and I think it's we need to really counter this kind of notions of reproducing the idea of Europe and this as this cradle of civilization that popped out up in the history, like out of nowhere, and to place it in the world and in its colonial and imperial history, in order exactly to see that in the production of this rational subject, the exploitation in colonies was involved, or exploitation of Central and Eastern European people, and how also these people colonized or exploited reproduce that kind of thinking. So yeah, we need to be radical here, I think.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely right on, sort of linking it to the European project, which very much speaks in this language of values and the common values. And anytime, and even in talking about why the transatlantic relationship is so important, right? Because we have these common values, and once you start invoking that language, you're really creating some sort of normative statement about what is a good value and what isn't. Mohammed.
Yeah, I completely agree with Paweł, actually. These were good points about the Common Values project. But I actually don't know much about what's going on in the schools, but I'm going to say something anyway about the project itself and reflect on both the children and also the adults. So I think actually, rather than kind of focusing on common values or a cultural core of society as kind of a core of the curriculum, it would be actually, especially in this day and age, to much more focus on teaching people how to communicate ultimately, especially if we're talking about diverse populations. And that, I think, is essential because we have two problems here. One of them, and I'm thinking here more about Europe in particular, there are lots of, say, public kind of studies about Islam, Muslim communities, all that. But a lot of this literature is really very text-based and theoretical in nature. Right? So in a sense, we have literature being produced about communities, but most people don't actually know individuals from Muslim communities as persons or as friends, so to speak, right? And that may be happening at the school level, right? Perhaps not so much among the adults or the older populations. Among those other demographics, what you see is a lot of talk about other people that is based on, say, some summary of the Quran or some kind of medieval text that is kind of uncritically just published in some main magazine and pretends to say the truth, of course, about Islam. Right? But what is missing is actually knowing people as empirical entities, as persons, right? Not as categories, not as theoretical constructs, and not as texts, even though that is part of our job as well. But the personal dimension is missing from the equation. And as long as it is missing, the decolonial project would be kind of insufficient. The other kind of advantage to this focus on how to communicate pertains to adults, I think. So in places like Germany, or the US, we know that we have polarized political cultures, right? Much more so than in the US, but that the phenomenon that we call populism that is now traveling around the globe kind of has created societies that do not or have less capacity to intercommunicate within themselves. And we're talking here about the majority society, so you can speak those terms, not just citizens versus foreigners. So there's a need to actually reawaken, not talk about the common values, but so much, because I don't think we can actually agree on those or arrive at them, but to kind of invest more in kind of reawakening or kind of defending or teaching how we communicate with people who are different from each other, right? And how do we kind of become interested in people as persons, as empirical entities, and not just as texts from the past or as statistical aggregates or some kind of abstractions like that. So I think in this project, schools can indeed be very helpful.
Indeed. Rowena.
Thank you, Allyson. It's been an interesting last few minutes listening about common values and stuff, because Scotland, of course, is part of 4 nations in the United Kingdom, and England often talks about British values. Scotland, seeing itself as a country in its own right, has actively rejected the notion of common values as denoted by British values. So actually it actively is trying to, I guess, it's actively redrawing what it means by values, and it's therefore given a very strong pro-migrant narrative, challenging xenophobia and racism, all forms of discrimination. So it talks about inclusivity, diversity. So it's trying to establish a different kind of values, more generic, more like what Mohammed is saying, you know, valuing people, listening, recognition, all that kind of stuff. Now, my work is is in schools, and the current direction of travel in Scotland is actually helping teachers and teachers being prepared for education to have conceptual clarity. So in Scotland, what's happened in the past is everybody talks about inclusion, diversity. Nobody's going to argue about that. They're lovely, warm, fluffy words, aren't they? But we don't talk about anti-racist. And one of the things I've always said to my students is, how are you going to include people if you don't first ask them how they're feeling excluded? So we have to talk about these uncomfortable exclusion, discrimination, all that kind of stuff. So in Scotland, inclusion is something that we do talk to our teachers about, and we actually make it very clear, diversifying your reading list is not decolonizing the curriculum. We make that very clear to them, because some people assume that diversifying the reading list is decolonizing the curriculum. No, that's part of inclusive curriculum. We then say to them, you need to move from that to an anti-racist curriculum, which looks at providing spaces to talk about things like racism at every level, and then it is decolonizing the curriculum. So that's what we're trying to do in schools here in Scotland. And there's appetite for that.
Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective. And I guess I would ask, as somebody who's doing this and who's seeing it, you know, play out and seeing how it's being implemented on the ground level, but also response, you know, I mean, it's no secret that the movement to decolonize the curriculum, anti-racist curricula, the various groups, especially on the right, see this movement and critical race theory as these kind of egregious political correctness run amok, or even a movement to shame white Americans or to deliberately tarnish the nation's image. So I'm curious as to, like, from your perspective, what's been the public response in Scotland and the UK, and more broadly in Europe, if you can speak to that.
Can I be brief? And I know Louie Dean wants to get in. I'll say something about the Scotland thing. So I think that I was finishing a government report a couple of years ago when BLM was reigniting and all that. And I wanted to use CRT, critical race theory, as one of the theoretical frameworks to base my report on. And I was immediately asked about the politics of that. And to be flippant, I have to say that I immediately said, well, Donald Trump does not want it, in which case the civil servants just backed off. And okay, I didn't get it to be the central base, but it was a footnote. And that's the first time CRT is now in a government report here in Scotland. So that's me being flippant. But on the more serious side, it's not the far right that surprises me at the moment on CRT. I'm seeing and for me, a dangerous and more problematic is the pushback from some quarters of the left, in fact, particularly socialist white people who are threatened about having to discuss their inherited advantages and having some of their icons and gurus of their disciplines being challenged or being taken away. For me, that is actually something that I've got to figure out how to respond to. Overall, as a country, I think the mood is that the time is right for change. There is no pushback on, we don't always call it CRT, but you know, I remember even 5 years ago, we couldn't even mention anti-racist. And now the government's pushing it. Every government documents use this kind of language here, which is great.
No. Louie Dean.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm sort of thinking about in the United States and even particularly Texas, there's a lot of discussion about the scary ghost of critical race theory. And one thing that I just kind of comes to my mind is this class that I taught last year that was 20th century European history, essentially. And the idea of it, I used some new books that just recently came out. One that was by Johnny Pitt's Afropean Notes from Black Europe. And I had some student pushback where students and in the book, he kind of goes between many, many different European countries writing about his experiences there in the 21st century. So we end the class with that. And some of the comments from students very particularly was in the feedback, this course spent too much time talking about non-white people. And it was a very blatantly racist comment, right? And it's one of those things where I think we have to kind of just keep on going, right? It's one of those things where, okay, yes, this is going to make people uncomfortable. Yes, it might undermine some people's expectations of what those classes are. But I think ultimately, the more that we kind of hold to the things, and I do think like Dr. Arshad's point about sort of having a more diverse reading isn't decolonizing, but I think it's a very important step. And once students start to see like, okay, these are things that are valuable enough to be put on a syllabus, and then you can have those conversations like she was saying, where we're going to talk about why is this here? What about this is anti-racist? I think like more sort of transparency in why we do these things that we're doing forces those conversations in a way that can be more productive. And the way I sort of always frame it in my classes is whenever I bring, for example, people of color, women, queer people into European history, European studies, what I'm not doing is, what I'm trying to do is fill in gaps, right? Make it a more complete, full idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about Europe. And I think whenever I frame it in that sense, it sort of alleviates some of those strains where it's not pushing other people out, it's trying to say we're being more fully considerate of what this thing is. And there will be some pushback. And I think that's fine. It opens up discussions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've had a similar reaction where very few, but a couple of students have commented, you know, you're spending too much time talking about non-Europeans. And I'm like, what about these people makes them not European? And you know what it is, you know, it's like, okay, let's talk about why that's not the case. But yeah, Paweł.
Yeah, I think, you know, what you just said reveals a quite interesting dynamics that can be, you know, made productive from these pushbacks. And, in Germany, it is there if you think of the AfD and and also the discussion about, whether it's a recent discussion, whether Germany is a migrant society or, how much migrant it is or not. But, me, myself coming from Poland, it's not maybe racism, but it's the gender ideology or gender theory is this specter now that is coming, from rotten West and is threatening the nation and our children. And but if you think about this, it's also a very racist kind of thinking that I think is also an outcome of this Western European constant racist thinking about all these other nationalities or states that are intolerant and putting themselves in this super tolerant position. So I think you have to look at these pushbacks and also reproduction of your own position as this rational, white, and super tolerant subject in in an entangled way, and as a constant reproducing itself dynamic, and how it interact with each other and how it maybe fuels each other.
This has brought up so many excellent points and a lot of big projects. And I think that this came up in the beginning of the conversation as, got hundreds of years to disentangle, and it's a big project, right? Decolonizing the curriculum is not happening overnight. So we're getting towards the end. So I think the way I'd like to end is to maybe bring it back to this question that's so germane, that's so at the top of my mind at the European Studies Center. And we've talked a little bit about it throughout this conversation, is what does decolonizing the curriculum mean for those of us who study Europe, and how can we decolonize European studies more particularly? But rather than just throwing that huge question out, I want to think incrementally and give us some action plan. So for people who are watching or who are gonna see this, I'd like each of you to maybe think of as our closing, what are some action items? What would you like to see as a first step that somebody could consider to start the project in their classroom or at their school or at their university? What's in your sort of action plan? Does anybody want to start that off? Paweł.
Yeah, I can start. Thanks. I think I'm going to go back to methodologies and, and also to refer to what Louie said, to give voices to, not dominant, subaltern stories, archives, and minorities, and bring them, so to speak, in and let them speak with you, and collaborate more with people also from academia. That's the one thing. And the other thing is, I think for me, it's the intersectional perspective and how, hierarchical thinking and essentializations are not only within something that we call racism, but also, in the ways we think about sexualities and genders, and where it becomes visible, and how we can, trace it back or make it visible.
Great, a great starting point. Rowena, what would be your sort of action item?
Well, we have a saying here in the UK that, when I say we, I mean those of us of color, we are here because you were there. And so I wonder whether one of the ways is simply to get students and to start discussing what Hamid Dabashi in his book, Europe and Its Shadows, Coloniality After Empire, suggests, and this is just discuss, Europe cannot be Europe without non-Europe. And within that, to be talking about how the damage done to colonized regions, but to equally look at how, as Paweł has said, this is dynamic, it's changing, how cultures, communities, discussions discussions about borders, nationality, etc., are now shaping the discussions of today.
Yeah, that's great. And we will put a link up to that book that you mentioned. Louie Dean.
Yeah, I was thinking just about the idea of like concrete things that have been things that I've noticed that I've really appreciated, I guess, is having sort of these places start with our local communities. I recently, well, pre-pandemic, was in Amsterdam. And one thing that the City Museum of Amsterdam was working with the City Museum in New York City was trying to think about how do you bring these discussions of colonialism into the City Museum. So how do you start to think about the urban landscapes that we're living in as part of the inheritance of colonialism? So Amsterdam has beautiful buildings, gorgeous architecture. Where did this money come from to pay for this, right? And I think like those sort of questions oftentimes get sort of erased whenever you're thinking about European history, especially, or European culture, especially if you're in Europe, is where did the funding come for these beautiful buildings? But also whenever you're thinking about sort of places like the United States, if you're talking about the grid system of streets, that was part of a sort of colonial project. Why do we have to have a gridded street system to better move in soldiers, right? And I think whenever I start to talk about conversations with those sort of very concrete things, students start to think about, oh, well, if my city has this legacy, how does that legacy affect me? How does that legacy affect the people that I interact with? And when you start to think about those types of things, it opens up different types of discussions. And that's always sort of one way that I try to start a lot of my classes. Also, a sort of thing that I have been doing more often is starting with the myth of Europa, the Greek myth, which is about a Phoenician woman who is kidnapped and raped by Zeus, Phoenicia being modern day Lebanon and Syria. And when you're talking about these types of things, just where does the name Europe come from? It has these issues deeply ingrained. And I think whenever you're willing to sort of start with those types of questions, it makes it easier to frame the class in ways that feel more challenging to the narrative just from the get-go.
Those are some great discussion starters. Yeah, great ideas. Mohammed.
Yeah, I think I very much like what Louie said, as well as other comments as well, namely the question of really, especially at the level of teaching, teach in a way that actually bring to the core how historical people, if we talk about history in particular, have thought of themselves, not as necessarily as part of Europe or as part of the Mediterranean, as part of some other kind of continuum, and kind of move away from the national histories that we are used to, that are superimpose themselves, a kind of an older period. So kind of a teaching strategy like that work. There is, and I tried as much as possible to do that in my classes as well, the choice of reading text to not just bring people from other parts of the world, but actually bring other genres, other ways of producing knowledge, and not just persons who do the same thing we do, they look different. The other thing I'd like to mention, which is kind of a recent kind of collective undertaking that I'm trying to get off the ground, is a research project where we actually explore the genealogy of key terms in the social sciences, including society, including religion, and so including solidarity. Those kinds of key terms in social analysis that we take to actually mean something really existing. But if you follow those terms through different languages and through different histories of use, from the 19th century to the present, then you discover a rich mixture, basically, of employments and uses. So the knowledge that we are presenting the people with is not as solid as it looks like, which is fine. I mean, it's not, I don't mean this as a complaint, but it is the terms we use in everyday language, right? Kind of their meaning, right, has been produced through the colonial experience, so to speak, right, and remain in place until today, so to speak, right. But other people in the world have tried to actually engage them and use them in their own languages, in Chinese or Arabic or Persian, so to speak, right, and by which they meant different things, not necessarily the same thing, and try to align kind of the meaning of those words about social analysis to what they regard to be illegitimate, a kind of way of living in the world. So I think whatever we do, whether it is at the level of research, decolonial research or decolonial teaching or what have you, for me, the objective is not to say racism is bad. I mean, that doesn't really even need to be said. But also not to say, well, look, we discovered that Voltaire was a racist, which people have said. And for me, that is actually not interesting either, ultimately, because it is not really just identifying historical figures that have been racist or not, but rather how to think about when did race become a way of thinking about identity, a constitution, and people. That term too has a history as well, right? And it may be replaced by something else, so to speak, as we move on. So the decolonial project for me is extremely rich because it goes back to, it's not just about getting rid of Europe. Now, that's not what it is. But it is really about going to at the fundamentals of our knowledge, basically as it exists right now. Right? And this is what for me makes it worthwhile, an exciting project. And not just to say, well, this is good and this is bad. We can do that, of course, this moralizing kind of game, and it is fine, but up to a point, but it is not education. As far as the way I look at it.
Yeah, a great reminder. This has been wonderful. I want to thank our panel for these insights and for getting this conversation going. And remember that this is just the first in a series that we're doing on kind of reckoning with the past. And the next one actually goes to something that Louie Dean just brought up. We're going to be talking in February about decolonizing museums in Europe. And then our March discussion is on the colonial past and reparations. So I'm looking forward to having more of these conversations. I want to thank you for joining us. It's been such a great conversation. And thanks to the audience. We will put all of this up online with suggested readings based upon the conversation and from things that our panelists have been doing, really interesting projects. So we'll try to link to them as much as we can. And please join us again, and thanks to our partners. Have a great day, everybody.